Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ann Palmer from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. We're just getting ready to start the webinar. We'll give people a couple more minutes to join. So it's about a minute after 1. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Funding Food Policy Council's Lessons from the Field webinar. My name is Ann Palmer. I'm a program director at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, which is at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. I just want to welcome all our 3 speakers today. We have Meredith Lathbury Girard from the Town Creek Foundation, Ha-Ngoc is a program associate at the Kendall Foundation, and Pollock is the network coordinator for the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. Just a couple of items, housekeeping items before we get started. We are going to be recording the webinar. It will be available a few hours after the broadcast. If you have any questions, we're going to hold questions to the end. And if you have a question for a specific speaker, please note that in the question. The box on the right-hand side is where you can type your questions. We'll be reading the questions out for the speakers, and that will happen after the 3 presentations. So we will go ahead and get started. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes telling you a little bit about the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Our center is focused on the intersection between public health, diet, the environment, and food production. And we do that with 3 different components. We work on education through coursework, curriculum development, and by supporting doctoral fellows. We conduct research on food systems, support other faculty research, and collaborate with other research institutions. And then finally, we have 4 program areas that are all focused on food policy, food production, food sustainability, and food communities. The Food Policy Network project, which is the project that's hosting this today, falls under the food communities area. You can see our mission statement up at the top. I'm not going to read that because I think you all know how to read it. Basically, we are working to help people working at the state and local level improve the quality of food policy work that they're doing through effective food policy. So basically, we have a number of different resources. This webinar is the first of what we hope will be quarterly webinars of thematic focus. In addition to the webinar today, we also have a document that has a number of case studies on how food policy councils have been funded, and we'll be sending that out after the webinar. Mark Winnie has been collaborating with us on the Food Policy Networks project, and Mark is also on the call today. He will be wrapping up some summary statements at the end of the webinar and after questions. We do have a listserv for folks who have not subscribed to the listserv. I think we have close to 900 subscribers. If you are a member of a food policy council or other stakeholder group focusing on food policy, we welcome you to register at the online database, which basically creates a directory of all the different groups working in the United States. And then we have a resource database that was released back in September with about 700 resources for groups working on food policy. And I already described the communication and outreach activities. We are also doing trainings. We have hosted our first Chesapeake Food Policy Leadership Institute in the fall, and we've been doing some conference workshops. So if you're interested in talking to us about that further, we'd be happy to help. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith, who is going to get us started today.
Great, thank you, Anne, and thanks so much to the Center for a Livable Future for hosting this today, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Meredith Lathbury Girard. I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Town Creek Foundation. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit quickly about Town Creek Foundation and our policy and advocacy focus in our grant making, and then also why we care about food policy councils and food. Town Creek Foundation is a family foundation based here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. We've been focused for many, many years primarily on policy and advocacy related to the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, as well as climate. And we have a long history of supporting policy and advocacy work on the environment in this region. A few years ago, the Town Creek Foundation made the decision to sunset. So in 2021, we will be closing our doors. And as part of sharpening our focus with our grant making and are increasingly investing in food system reform. And, you know, it's an interesting distinction in terms of the capacity for advocacy. When we look at some of the work that's been done in the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, many, many decades of work and advocacy, seasoned advocates working in that space. But in our food system reform work, we're actually in the process of trying to build that advocacy capacity. Next. So why do we care about food as an environmental foundation? Well, our theory of change is that part of the reason that we are seeing so much pollution in the Chesapeake Bay and the causes of climate change have to do with the roots of our food system. And so, as you can see in these photographs here, you see lots of chickens and chicken houses. Industrialized agriculture is a big cause of pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. So with the time that we have left to be able to impact some sort of change in this region, we are focused on trying to transition towards a food system that is more equitable, that is right-sized for our environment, and that is building community wealth instead of being more extractive in nature. So we've identified a couple of key levers to focus our investments. One is around building the capacity for advocacy for food system reform, and that's where food policy councils come in. We've been funding food policy councils throughout Maryland, and Maryland is the geography that we're focused on. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. A second key lever is building connectivity. So because the food movement in this region is so new, we've heard from so many of the people that we're partnering with and are funding that there is a huge need for building networks right now. So that's another major focus of our grant making related to food. And then the third key lever that we're focusing on is building the marketplace. So trying to build the markets for institutional purchase of sustainably grown food, and also to start to highlight the environmental sustainability aspect of food production. Next. So I want to say a few words about what we think about from a funder's perspective with respect to indicators of financial sustainability. And I think the main frame that we are thinking about with respect to food policy councils is that we're not exactly sure whether food policy councils necessarily are long-term sustained entities themselves. We think that it's possible that food policy councils may be more ephemeral in nature, so more of a vehicle towards institutionalization of food policy. So what we're interested in is figuring out how to help food policy councils best position and leverage their current opportunity. And so we're not necessarily very focused on figuring out whether food policy councils have really diverse funding streams, or if they're trying to expand their donor base, for example. And those are things we might actually be looking at for the other nonprofits that we fund. But in the case of food policy councils, what we're most interested in looking at is the approach. So we really like to see government participation. I'm going to say a few more words about that later. We also are very interested in cross-sectoral support because we think of food policy councils as being a really important alternative table to bring together voices that might not otherwise have an empowered and influential impact on the political landscape in particular. And it's an opportunity to build connections across sectors. And then this last piece is something that has been particularly important in Maryland, where food policy councils are really just starting to emerge, which is that commitment to planning and assessment. And a component of that we're interested in is seeing what sorts of metrics and indicators thinking about to frame their work, but to measure their progress also as they move forward. Next. So I want to say a few words about the relationships between food policy councils and government, because I think, as you all know probably who are listening, that there's a pretty wide continuum of ways that food policy councils and governments are working together or not working together. And so from our perspective, we see that relationship as being really, really important because ultimately government and food policy councils are going to need to be working together to be able to best leverage and align resources and to make more meaningful progress. That being said, how that relationship actually is structured really depends on the place. So in some places, it might very much make sense to be closely aligned with government. So for example, in Western Maryland, you have a really great interest in food policy from local government. So it's not just county, but it's also towns and different entities that are associated, closely associated with government. And so we're really interested to see what happens with the development of a food policy council that's very much in that, that government connection. The challenge could be for the folks working in that part of the state that they may have less capacity on the advocacy side because of some of the limitations of working in that government framework. And so they may need to build some capacity outside of their food policy council to be able to advocate for more progressive reforms. In other parts of the region, we see a different way of structuring things. So in Montgomery County, Maryland, for example, the Food Council there grew up very much out of an initiative that came from the county executive's office. However, the Food Council made a very intentional decision not to be housed within government so that they could be advocates. And then here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where you have a pretty entrenched system with respect to connections to the chicken industry and industrialized agriculture, it's much more difficult to establish close connections with government. And so food policy council efforts on the Eastern Shore of Maryland are taking place largely outside of that government space, but eventually will need to move to be more closely aligned with government. Next. So I'm going to say a few words about how we think about the grantee-grantor relationship, and we would love to be able to stroll into every meeting with folks like Oprah, saying, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car. And thanks to my our program assistant here at Town Creek Foundation for being so hip and putting together this presentation for me, but also this slide in particular. I think what really helps in terms of building those relationships is to think of your funders as resources beyond grant making. So to brainstorm with them, to talk with your funders about how to leverage your food policy council's position with its partners into a bigger strategy. How do you fit into a broader framework? So maybe your food policy council is, and rightfully ought to be focused on locally relevant issues and programs, but how does that fit into a bigger picture? We're also very interested in the Town Creek Foundation, in particular collaborative approaches, and I think a lot of other funders share that. So we are always really excited when grantees come together to fill a particular need that they're seeing in the landscape that we're also seeing in the landscape. Some funders really like to start with specific projects that have, a specific set of deliverables, and that is always a great place to start. From the Town Creek, we're most interested in trying to fill particular needs and identify interventions that we think will help catalyze progress. And so we try to bring people together to have a conversation about what those needs are and try to figure those out collectively and figure out a way to get those things accomplished. Next. So a few words of advice that we have for food policy councils. First, to be really expansive in your thinking about the sectors that you're engaging in the conversation with your food policy councils. One thing that we see in Maryland is that we think labor could be, and workforce development interest could be a much bigger player in food policy councils. And so we're hoping to try to find ways to build those connections. And as I mentioned earlier, underrepresented voices are really important to this discussion, and the food space is a really important place for that equity to be fully integrated from the ground floor up. Another is I would encourage folks to build a conversation and a dialogue. In Maryland, we're still in the very beginning stages of building a food movement, and so conversation is really important, and dialogue is one of the ways that we're going to be able to start to coalesce around a common vision for the future. And so to the extent that food policy councils can help to be building those conversations that need to be had in the community, that is a way to also engage funders, because then you can try to bring them into the conversation, certainly use them as a resource beyond grant making for ideas and connections to other folks that they are funding that are doing similar work. And to use those conversations as a launch pad for building collaborative efforts. So with that, I'm going to close, and I am going to pass the baton to Ty. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, Meredith. Hi, everyone. My name is Ha-Ngoc. I am the Program Associate at the Henry P. Kendall Foundation. I'm excited to share our approach towards funding food policy and food policy councils in particular. So I'll walk us through our strategy in terms of why we support food systems and food policy, and how we identify opportunities in food policy councils. I'll move on to some thoughts on financial sustainability, similar to Meredith, and end with a couple of examples of current Kendall grantees and a few words about the grantor-grantee relationship. Next. So the Henry P. Kendall Foundation is based in Boston. It was actually founded in 1957 to focus on land conservation and the prevention of nuclear proliferation, eventually expanding into climate and energy funding in the 90s and early 2000s. In 2011, the foundation transitioned to focus solely on food systems funding with a mission of increasing the production and consumption of local food in New England. So we've tied our success to what is called the New England Food Vision, which sets a bold goal of producing 50% of the region's food needs by 2060. And this vision has been put together by the Food Solutions New England Initiative, which is a collaborative network of food system leaders in the region. Next. So how do we make our vision a reality? We do this by employing two strategies. Our regional strategy is focused on helping build a region that is connected and well coordinated in each of the 6 New England states, where leaders across the region are collaborating towards the shared 2060 vision, and where key food infrastructure such as food hubs are in place. Then we also employ the groundwork strategy, which is focused on 3 discrete population centers in southern New England, So this is Boston, the Route 91 corridor from Greenfield, Massachusetts down to New Haven and the state of Rhode Island. And here we're trying to build demand for local food and create examples and models of healthy local food systems. Next. So where does policy fit into all this work? I'll start by saying that the foundation entered the field in 2011, and we saw that food policy councils were natural convening points for our own learning and for the learning of community members around food and food systems issues. We take a systems approach in our grant-making strategy, and this means that we look at the relationship between the many different components of the food system to ensure the greatest chance of creating change within the system. And in doing our work, we see policy and advocacy as one of the tools for creating this change. And policy is an important lever for food systems change, as it can be effective in two forms, from both the top-down and bottom-up perspective. So from the top down, a government's implementation of local food policies can have broad changes in a community's food system. For example, just recently in Boston and in Springfield, they had community, in Boston, the urban agriculture Article 89, and in Springfield, the Community Garden Ordinance were both examples where a single policy significantly expanded urban food production opportunities across their respective cities. And then on the other hand, food policy councils also provide opportunities for grassroots discussions around local food policies and programs. Many of the food policy councils that we work with are convening and educational points for their communities, oftentimes bringing together policymakers, nonprofit and business leaders, and community activists. So in general, we see local food policy councils as an effective tool for engaging community members in policymaking and creating broad changes across local food systems. I do want to note that we're still exploring different ways of using policy and advocacy, always checking ourselves by asking questions such as what kind of funding and other support is needed to succeed at the regional, state, and our groundwork levels. Next. So when we're identifying opportunities to partner with food policy councils, one of the things that we look for first and foremost is strong leadership, especially leadership within the food policy councils. So we ask ourselves a question such as, is there a person or a group of people that has the ability to lead a collaborative effort? An important example of this is the ability to understand when to move a group conversation forward towards a specific action versus knowing when to let a conversation run through its process and build alignment across a specific action. On a couple of occasions, I've seen councils get bogged down on a particular issue and valuable momentum was lost. So leadership within a food policy council is important. Also, leadership within the community is something that we try to look for as well. So looking at whether the council is well respected and viewed as a convener and connector of other players in the local food system. And this means being respected by both the healthy local food systems advocates who work in this area on a daily basis, but also local government agencies, traditional agricultural associations, and local business leaders, etc. It should go without saying that we're definitely looking for strong representation from the community as well as different components of the food system. And I want to end on this point that our determination of leadership is definitely more of an art than a science. We try to talk to different stakeholders, other funders, look at reports and articles that have been written about or by the food policy councils, and this generally gives us a good idea of whether there are questions about leadership. Next. So financial sustainability. This remains a pretty tricky question for us, especially as some of the food policy council grantees in our portfolio are only a few years old or are new to receiving outside grant support. So at the moment we're more focused on enabling local food policy councils to achieve early policy and community engagement wins, and hoping that this will draw attention to their important role in the food system. However, I can say that as a regional funder, we are very encouraged when we see financial support from other local funders. Leo Pollock, who will follow me, will also go into how the Rhode Island Food Policy Council is funded, but in short, we came in at a time when 2 local Rhode Island funders had supported the initial work of the council, and that was very crucial in terms of how we entered the scene. Not only is it important to have a diversified stream of funding, but this can also be helpful in widening the network of funding opportunities, as well as something that Meredith mentioned, which is having local funders involved as stakeholders in the Food Policy Council's work. And a word about the local government. So funding from local government also presents an interesting scenario, as it can be both an indicator of financial sustainability, such as when a council's budget is brought into a city's general budget, but this can also put it at risk, especially during changes in elected officials and administrations. Next. And continuing on this theme of local government, we've seen and supported various partnership structures at the state and local levels. For example, the Rhode Island Food Policy Council is housed outside of government, while the Massachusetts Food Policy Council was established by a state legislator and has 10 state agency and legislative members on its council. Either way, as I'm sure you all know, it's important to have the support of government officials, as they're key people in changing and implementing policies. Next. So I thought it might be helpful to share a couple of examples of the ways that we've supported food policy. One of our first examples is the New Haven Food Policy Council. They were established by city ordinance in 2005, and for a few years they tackled some smaller pieces of the food systems work, but then in 2009 they led a food action planning effort across the community. And while this council has had to overcome its share of challenges, particularly in regard to dealing with a change in city administration, we were particularly drawn to them because of their strong leadership in the community and their collaborative structure. I would definitely encourage today's webinar participants to check them out. You can just Google the New Haven Food Policy Council, and there's plenty of information about them. So our work with the New Haven Food Policy Council has followed a few stages. It started with 2 small grants. Our first grant in 2012 was to support a community-wide food summit at City Hall, which engaged the community around recommendations identified in their food action plan. And this consisted of a set of policy recommendations for the City of New Haven's food system. Then in 2014, as a result of ongoing conversations with the leadership of the Food Policy Council, we made a small investment to support their efforts in engaging the city's new administration in the creation of a full-time food systems director to help coordinate food-related initiatives across the city and the community. This was actually one of the priorities identified in the food action plan. And so as things stand now, we're very excited to have put out a 2-year grant challenge to the city's administration to encourage them to match our funds in supporting a full-time food systems director, a part-time support staff, and initial programming budget. And the city's mayor has included this matching funding in her proposed budget, and we're expecting to hear back from the Board of Aldermen whether this was a successful bid in the coming months. Next. I do want to note one other area of policy that we have supported that may not be directly related to local food policy councils, but this is the Regional Food Policy Council Regional Food Policy Report, which was published last year as a collaboration between the American Farmland Trust, Conservation Law Foundation, and Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group. This report highlights specific policy opportunities and barriers in strengthening the New England food system. And while it focuses primarily on increasing regional food production, it goes into local policy and food access issues. So I would encourage folks to look at this as an example of a resource where state and local food policy councils can draw from for ideas to spur policy changes in their communities. Next. And I want to take a moment to step back and share some thoughts on what makes a good grantor-grantee relationship. I'll speak to this from both perspectives. For grantees, we expect open and ongoing communication about both successes and challenges in major changes, such as notification that there's been an unexpected departure of a Food Policy Council's chairperson. And so there really shouldn't be any surprises in a narrative report or follow-up meetings at the end of a grant period, since these should be conveyed to the funder as it happens or just right after it happens. And I say this because funders can be valuable partners in working through strategic challenges such as staffing changes or issues in the community, and also be able to bring in other funders. So don't be afraid to tell them about issues that they may be able to help with. I think that's something that Meredith also mentioned in her presentation. And so remember that our success as a foundation depends on the success of our grantees. And from our end as a funder, we should also be open and ongoing about our communication of how we see the work going. In particular, there shouldn't be any surprises from the grantee's perspective if funding is reduced or cut at the end of a grant period. If something isn't going as expected, this should be made clear to the grantee to help align understandings and work towards solving the problem together. And then in the few cases where the renewal of a grant doesn't make sense, a funder can help connect the grantee with other potential funders. And so I'd like to end with a couple of pieces of advice for food policy councils seeking funding. First, seek funders across sectors and frame your work in a way that fits funders' interests without changing the purpose of the work. Food has an impact on almost every area of philanthropy, from child obesity, community and economic development, youth development, conservation, and the list goes on. And lastly, be open with what you need and how much you need. For example, if you're hoping to launch a series of in-depth community gatherings over the course of a year, be clear that you'll need staff capacity. And don't just ask for event sponsorship. At worst, the funder might have thoughts on how and where to find funding to complement their own contribution. And so being open about how much you need and what you need gives the best chance for a successful grant partnership and opportunity for continued support. Next. So in closing, I'm truly excited about the potential that exists in food policy councils in our region and across the nation, and the work that's currently happening. Hopefully this has been helpful sharing our perspective and our approach in funding food policy councils. And I'd like to pass it on to one of our great grantees, Leo from the Rhode Island Food Policy Council.
Thanks, Ty. So as Ty mentioned, my name is Leo Pollock. I serve as the network coordinator for the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. I'm just going to share a little bit about how the Rhode Island Food Policy Council got started and launched, some of the things we've done, and then end with similarly some advice and thoughts on food policy councils in general and kind of the question of long-term sustainability and relationships with funders. Next. So as with a number of folks probably on this call, we're really taking a food system approach with the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. And I think sometimes as people kind of invested in this work and on the ground doing this work, we tend to overlook that this isn't necessarily the way that people understand food right now. So I do think food policy councils have a responsibility for really educating and trying to show the interconnections and relationships with the parts of the food system. So this is a core part of the Food Policy Council to really educate that food system in Rhode Island isn't just about production and consumption, it's about the way that all these pieces connect and how the strength of the system is really as strong as those individual parts. Next. So a few facts that I just wanted to share about Rhode Island because I think they're important in understanding a little bit of the context of where the idea of the Food Policy Council came from here and kind of that have helped shape some of its priorities and focus areas. So Rhode Island is the smallest state in the country, a little over 1,200 square miles. One of the most population-dense states in the country as well, I think behind New Jersey. Those obviously have a big impact on kind of what's happening in the state and what we're seeing. Other things that are worth, I think, considering is we're a state that's seeing some of the same demographic changes that the United States is seeing overall. A significant shift in terms of people of color and as well kind of concentration in urban and suburban areas. Unfortunately, Rhode Island also is showing some of the highest rates of food insecurity and hunger in New England. This number, unfortunately, has been consistently going up, and as of last year, the food insecurity rate was over 14%. So a real challenge, obviously, related to accessibility and affordability of food. At the same time, Rhode Island is also seeing an agriculture sector that's growing. So from the last 2 ag censuses, we've seen almost a 45% increase in the number of farms. And I think the one point mentioning with that is the majority of those farms are actually less than 10 acres. So obviously relates to land availability and population density, but we're seeing a growth in agriculture that's really intensive agriculture on smaller scale properties. Next. So the Food Policy Council really kind of, the conversation about it started in 2010. That was a convening with a number of folks kind of working at different levels on food issues. So everyone from urban agriculture organizations to the Rhode Island Community Food Bank to the Department of Health and our Division of Agriculture at the state level. And I think it really came from a recognition that there was a lot of grassroots work happening in Rhode Island, but not necessarily a voice or any kind of advocacy for food systems at the state level. And so there were funders involved in those conversations early on. We'll mention them later, but the Van Buren Charitable Foundation, which is based in Newport, Rhode Island, and then the Rhode Island Foundation, which is based in Providence. But the goal was really, as a starting point, to really start with a planning process, about 8 months, just to really bring people together and kind of build, before jumping straight into any kind of action, to really kind of build agreement on what's the goal of this, what can we learn from the way food policy councils are developing across the country. And we did work with the Interaction Institute for Social Change, who really has some great trainings on kind of facilitating large system change processes. We also had a conversation with Mark Winnie, who I know is on this call as well. So that 8-month process really kind of set us up. Next slide, please. And coming out of that, it's a critical first step for Food Policy Council to try to build kind of vision and goals. And so I'm not going to read the vision, but a couple points that I just want to mention. Obviously, community food security, given those food insecurity rates in Rhode Island, was a real concern among folks that were coming together in that initial space. Obviously, accessibility and affordability, 2 big issues around food security. And the goal is really, to try to build the capacity of the state in terms of food production. Obviously, Rhode Island as the ocean state, not only land-based production, but aquaculture as well as fisheries. And then finally, the last piece that was interesting in terms of that 2010 timeframe was a lot of folks felt like food work in Rhode Island had sort of been pigeonholed in kind of the environmental space and, socially significant, but not economically significant. And so that was one of the real goals of coming together, was to say, how can this Food Policy Council be a voice for advocating that the food system in Rhode Island is a significant part of the economy and something that the state should be both looking at and investing in. Next. And so 4 goals kind of came out of that planning year, around access to healthy food, the economic space that I just mentioned. Healthy food environment was much more about moving Rhode Island's food system towards zero waste, and then obviously increasing the production capacity of the state as well as the demand for local food. And interestingly enough, since that time, we're actually going to be adding a fifth goal specific to public health, population health, because a lot of people felt like that's obviously a growing connection point for food system work, and wasn't explicit enough in the vision and goals that the Food Policy Council first launched with. So I think that's just something that as things evolve, leaving that flexibility is really important as well. Next. So just to give you kind of a snapshot of structure, I think we really approached the Food Policy Council from the beginning as a network, not really an organization. So obviously there's a strong kind of policy side to it, but the goal was, how do we, through work groups and through committees, start to sort of embed the mission, the vision of the goals, and provide a space to bring people together that have connections to that work, but maybe either aren't working together or there's some breakdown in collaboration. And so the goal was really how does the structure evolve based on needs on the ground or specific issues that come up, and how does the Food Policy Council stay flexible enough? So, this is a snapshot. This structure continues to evolve. Work groups take on specific projects or flex in and out, but I think that network is really central to kind of how we look at it and how the Food Policy Council evolves over time. Next. So just wanted to share a few quick examples of the kinds of things the Food Policy Council is doing now. This is a series that we've sponsored. This will be the third year, called Food Matters. And the goal is really about outreach and education, raising awareness about issues in the food system, and really at its core, bringing people together, having them break bread and eat together and really talk about food system issues. Some of them have taken the form of panels, some of them as more formal presentations, some just work group discussion. But the goal has really been bringing people together. And that's something that, in terms of that wider outreach, wider raising awareness, has been really successful. Next. Relish Rhody was the Food Policy Council's effort to do a campaign around Food Day with Center for Science and the Public Interest. This was based on the Big Apple Crunch, I believe in New York, but it was more of a social media campaign, just getting people to send in photos of production, consumption, all those different parts of the food system, and really just a way to kind of showcase, here are the ways that food relates to our everyday lives. And so these were then shared on Facebook. We show slideshows of this at all Food Policy Council events, and it's just been kind of a nice way to make this relevant to kind of what people are doing in their everyday. Next. I wanted to share the Local Agriculture and Seafood Act Grants Program is kind of a unique public-private partnership that the Food Policy Council has been involved with. So the Food Policy Council is working directly with the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, and that's where in Rhode Island the Division of Agriculture is housed. This came about actually as an idea developed by the Department of Environmental Management originally, and the goal is really, is there an opportunity for the state to invest directly in local food, but for the Food Policy Council as a partner in that to leverage philanthropic funders as a matching program for that grants program as well. So our first grant year was last year, and what was exciting is we had $100,000 allocated from the state in the governor's budget, and that was matched by $110,000 from 3 different funders: the Henry P. Kendall Foundation, the Van Buren Charitable Foundation, and the Rhode Island Foundation. And so, the goal of this program was really to get funds directly into the hands of startup and early stage food businesses, and really to help grow local agriculture, seafood promotion, and to try to really emphasize partnerships, education, collaboration. So there were 17 projects funded. last year. This year we had another $100,000 allocated from the state, and actually we're able to up the amount of philanthropic funding. But I think this is a good example of, the state, part of the leverage that funders can provide is, a willingness to put funds in if the state is really willing to match them. And for us, the Food Policy Council has been able to use that to really push the state to develop a longer-term dedicated funding stream for this. And that conversation is happening in the legislature right now. Next. And so the last piece I wanted to mention was just the policy side. Quickly, the Food Policy Council does do some policy tracking legislation based on our goals, and we'll provide testimony or letters to legislators on issues that we think really hit multiple goals and have an impact or are impacted by the food system. We also, in a election year last year, saw a real opportunity with an incoming governor who had spoken about the importance of food to provide kind of a briefing paper that both talked about what is the food system, assessed a little bit what is happening in each sector of the food system in Rhode Island, and then offered recommendations that we felt the executive branch could really champion. And so this wasn't shared publicly, but this was shared last December with the hope that this will influence the now Governor Raimondo's priorities around investments in the food system and what the executive branch really has the opportunity to move. Next. So I've mentioned some of our funders. I just wanted to share, the Henry P. Kendall Foundation really has taken a region-wide approach to food systems development, and it's been exciting to see their support of Rhode Island as kind of one of those examples of really what does food systems look like in an urban suburban state. The Rhode Island Foundation, based in Providence, they're really looking at economic issues. In particular, we fall under their environment program. The Van Buren Charitable Foundation, based in Newport, generally funds just Newport County, but their interest is wider in terms of kind of agricultural viability issues in the state. And then the John Merck Fund has really, just in the last year, been funding the Food Policy Council around data work, and that's part of their larger data support across New England as well. So I think, as both Meredith and Ty talked about, these funders are all in communication with each other, and the way we look at it is sort of a convergence model where we're developing kind of priorities based on both what we see on the ground as well as what we're talking with funders about their interests and kind of alignment. And I think that process of communication over the years has been really strong. Next. Just wanted to share, also in the interest of transparency, kind of the numbers. So the Food Policy Council I mentioned was kind of formally launched in 2011. We're now, I guess, going into our fifth year. So in 2011, we did have some additional funding for working with the Interaction Institute as a process planning consultant. We did commission a food system assessment done by CARP Resources out of New York. But in general, the funding has been relatively stable. Obviously, in the last 2 years, there's been an investment in the Loss of Grants program, which is essentially a pass-through. But this year, the bump, and I'm excited to share this, is we recognize that the roles we're asking of work group chairs in particular required kind of a more formal arrangement and some funding. And so for this year, we're actually about to move forward with stipends for work group chairs for the first time. In general, over the course of the years, the base support has funded myself as a part-time network coordinator, and then another part-time staff position as an outreach and communications coordinator. So just to give people a sense of kind of our budget and evolution over the last 5 years. Next. So I want to just end with a little bit of advice based on my own experience and the experience of the Food Policy Council in this work. I think both Meredith and Ty talked about a little bit about this, but we really do see funders as partners in this, and that with food policy councils in general, this is a new arena. In particular with networks, I think there's no sense of this is the model and it's going to work everywhere. It's locally based. It's obviously responding to the uniqueness of who's coming together and what issues are important. And so we really do think this kind of encouraging funders to also enable the experimentation that's part of this. And I see the role of food policy councils as really being responsible for kind of laying the vision out for change, as well as the process for how to move there. And I think that process action tension is always going to be there. In our mind, we have done some kind of process mapping, and I think that's helpful just for people participating as well as for funders to get a sense of kind of what is the trajectory that you're hoping for, and then knowing that things are going to evolve and change based on that as well. And so I think it's important to kind of build key agreements, set up that structure and system, and then leave room for adaptation and flexibility as things move along. My rule is always, if some people are complaining that there's too much process and some people are complaining that things are moving too quickly, that we're falling somewhere in between, and that, as the network coordinator, is sort of where we should be ending up. The other piece with Food Policy Council is, I think, kind of finding the level that's appropriate. I would really encourage, as Food Policy Councils focus on, system-wide issues, the goal should really be to stay at that kind of 30,000-foot level, assessing what's happening, looking at the system as a whole, encouraging kind of on-the-ground pilots, looking at policy changes, but staying out of necessarily getting into on-the-ground programming, having staff that are really working on the on-the-ground changes. Next. And I'll just end with kind of quick thoughts on, the long-term question. As Meredith and Ty mentioned as well before, I really question, is the role of the Food Policy Council to sustain itself? For me personally, it's more about kind of finding ways to embed the mission, vision, and goals into kind of more permanent structures, getting systems thinking into those structures, whether that's policy, whether that's the way that different government agencies communicate and work with one another, how nonprofits or institutions collaborate, the way that students are engaged with the community around these issues outside of the classroom, how businesses operate in terms of values. That's really, it seems like the opportunity to try to get those goals and values built into as many of those kind of permanent structures as possible. The second is really about convergence funding, just thinking about the Food Policy Council having this role of helping facilitate, bringing people together, helping communicate with funders, bringing in additional funders, as well as then using that leverage point with the state, or whether it's the state or local government. But I think that's really where this needs to go. And I'll end with sort of the question is obsolescence the ultimate goal? Facilitation and coordination will always be important, but in my mind, the value of the Food Policy Council is not in sustaining itself, it's in bringing in additional funding and kind of embedding those systems in a way that the system itself starts to change. And so the goal, in my mind, would be, can a Food Policy Council create a space where those are so embedded that the Food Policy Council itself is obsolete? So I'll end with that, and I think pass it back to Anne.
Thanks so much, Meredith, Ty, and Leo. Those were excellent presentations. I think I did not mention at the beginning that one of the reasons we picked this topic for our first topic was because a lot of councils and other stakeholder groups really struggle to find support for their work. And we felt like this was very relevant and that there were some groups out there doing some excellent work. and had some very creative ways of going about funding their work and just developing resources in general. So I'm going to stop there, and it is now time to open it up for questions. We had a couple of people type in questions. I do want to remind folks that are on the webinar, if you have a question for a specific presenter, please note that when you're typing your question. Otherwise, we're going to open it up to the group. And Mark, I'm going to have you unmute yourself also, because I think we've had a few questions already, but I think that you might be well poised to answer some of these. So the first question is, can you recommend funder in the New Jersey Foundation that would be interested in funding a New Jersey, New York metropolitan area food policy council? And that might be beyond the scope of the presenter's work, but I don't know if anybody else has any feedback for that question.
This is Mark. I'm a little reluctant to respond to that question, only at least with everybody present. I mean, I have an idea or two, but I really don't. I feel like I might be putting somebody on the spot, so I would perhaps we could address that offline.
That sounds great. We've got the person's question, the name who's answered the question. So, and then the next question speaks to Leo's comment actually at the end, which is, what is the role in terms of funding? And so the question was, beyond government funding and private grants, any examples of self-sustainable funding, which we then clarified, this is councils that are actually generating revenue on their behalf. So I don't know if anybody has examples of that or that's on the webinar that could speak to that. Anybody? So I don't think that, I could think that must mean that there are probably not any examples. I don't think we've run into any that have been sustaining their own funding, frankly, from any sort of revenue generating sources.
This is Meredith. I think the way I would, I can't think of any examples either, but the thing that I would maybe question about sort of thinking about that model is that it might force a food policy council to be sort of really focused on program delivery, and that may be exactly where that community is at and might be what's needed. But along the lines of Leo's comment of trying to stay at that 30,000 foot level and trying to stay focused on that big picture, it may be that there would need to be capacity built outside of that food policy council to sustain those programs for a long term.
That's great. Thanks, Meredith. There was another response from somebody on the webinar who pointed out that Growing Power in Chicago also has a food business that helps to fund their food policy council work. Next question is, what suggestions can you give to a brand new food policy council that's seeking funding? So I think these are broadly, not necessarily specific funders, but just broadly, what sort of suggestions would folks give?
And I can jump in on the beginning of that. I mean, I really do think, in the beginning, it's exciting to see people come together, and I think the tendency is, okay, let's immediately start doing things. And I think that, although that's the logical step, I think it's, having someone help take that step back and say, okay, what's the longer term either goal or vision that we're working towards, and can we get everyone on board with that? That starts to then lay out, okay, what are the specific steps that are going to help us go there? And I think part of it is then approaching funders as partners to say, here's the process that we want to use to get to the point where there are some on-the-ground actions, and would you help us fund, that process? And I think even getting getting funders involved in that conversation early is going to help, both get their feedback on, is that the right way to go, and, bring them into the conversation early enough that they don't feel like they're just being asked for the resources, but that their expertise and their thinking is really incorporated into it.
Yeah, this is Mark. I would agree with that entirely and add that going to a foundation perhaps right at the beginning and say, we want to develop our capacity as a community-wide organization to address food system issues in a more of a coalition framework, not even having defined yourselves yet as a food policy council, and getting support for such things as visioning work, outreach, develop strategic planning, really very much groundwork, process work that will build the strength of your organization and therefore your capacity to do policy work in the long run. That might mean funding a facilitator, a person with expertise in working with groups to develop strategic plans. It might also be work that gets funded to do a community food assessment and community food plan. These are all the early steps that food policy councils take, but they're the kind of work that I think can be and has been supported by community foundations.
Great.
I would also just a quick note that an example that might be helpful that we haven't particularly been involved in because they're slightly outside of our groundwork area, but in Concord, Massachusetts, the initial group of the Food Policy Council had partnered with a local graduate program to put together a community food assessment just to get the conversation going and to have something that could be shared with funders. And so I would definitely look to nearby universities and colleges and as a potential partner in reaching out to foundations.
Thanks.
This is Meredith. The only thing I would add to what the other folks suggested is that I think at the earliest stages it's really important to start to build political leadership and interest from your decision makers. So to the extent that you're doing planning and developing a food system assessment or developing a food plan, to find ways to engage local elected officials at the earliest stages would be my recommendation.
We did have a webinar participant also offer up that some food policy councils do presentations and consulting for local institutions on good food policy. And while it's not necessarily self-sustaining, but it does help supplement some of the ongoing costs. Our next question is, we have a county-based group that promotes local food producers. We think we need to create a more regional council to achieve critical mass and aggregate resources, such as a food hub and our website. Does anybody have experience and or advice about moving from county to regional?
This one example I would give would be, it may even be on the line, I don't know, but the Douglas County Food Policy Council in Lawrence, Kansas, is a group that recently completed a food hub feasibility study that did, obviously through the course of that study, did look at their region's food system and basically expanded their focus as a county food policy council by looking more broadly at their food shed and in coming up with a very solid feasibility study for a food hub. I'll mention, however, that they were, as a food policy council, they were grounded in sort of a broader mission than simply establishing a food hub or even addressing only the production issues and marketing issues of their agricultural sector. They were looking at really all the stakeholders and really everybody within their food system, and I think that gave their work of a food hub a little more of a grounding in the broader food system and a wider array of needs. But you might want to take a look at the Douglas County Food Policy Council work.
And I will note that that is one of our case studies that we're going to be sending out to everybody. So Next question. Are there any food policy councils out there that anyone knows of that derive a significant portion of their funding directly from the community as opposed to foundations? I guess nobody's got.
I mean, I'm not sure if that, by community, at what level we're talking about here, but I mean, community in the sense of community foundations, local city and county sources, sometimes the members of the Food Policy Council itself, often through in-kind support. So you'll see that, I mean, if we define community in that sense and at that level as opposed to, say, individual households or very small organizations and associations, we see community, but probably not. I'm not aware of much that would be, down at really at a very grassroots level.
Thanks, Mark. Next question. Could you speak to the difficulties or ease of getting a city, county, state government to create a full-time employee position like the food systems director position mentioned during the New Haven presentation? So Ty, I'll turn that to you.
Sure. Yeah, that's been it's been an ongoing process with our communications with the New Haven Food Policy Council. It's been taking a while, in part because the new mayor had started around this time or last year and had a number of priorities to take on in her first several months, and that didn't match up well with the fiscal year of the city. But we were able to support some time prior to really pitching it to the mayor, where a local nonprofit was able to talk to different city agency heads and stakeholders and community members and really just build a consensus around the need for a full-time food systems director. And so far that's been paying off, especially in having the budget for the food systems director be put into the mayor's proposal. And so I would definitely encourage folks to really take the time to build consensus around if this is really a need for the city, and if it is, to reach out to folks that have a stake in making that decision and having the contact lists in place for the food systems director to succeed once he or she is in place.
And I also will mention, thanks for that, Ty, that we recently just compiled a bunch of responses to an inquiry on the listserv about job descriptions. And so if anyone's interested, you can go to the resource database, and it's under our frequently asked questions. I'm going to stop there. I think we've asked most of the questions and turn it over to Mark. Mark, we have about 7 minutes left. I didn't know if you had any thoughts that you'd like to share with folks to wrap up.
Sure, I can find something to say in 7 minutes. Thank you for some really great presentation, Meredith, Ty, and Leo. They were really top notch, and I think I learned a lot. So I hope others did as well. I'm just going to summarize a few points, add a couple of my own. I think the really critical thing here is you come in with a big vision and you think about the food system. That gives you, the broadest scope possible, which often enables you to go to multiple funding sources, different sectors, ones that you might not be able to access otherwise if you were simply looking at, a narrower band of the food system. I think also, to me, sort of the big lesson in listening to everybody was that, funding and fundraising are not independent functions. You don't separate them off as something that you do independently of the rest of the work of the Food Policy Council. You don't have somebody just sitting in a room writing grants. Fundraising has to be part of your communication process. It has to be part of your vision. It has to be even a part of your evaluation. I don't think we heard much about evaluation, but I'm assuming that foundations and other funders are always going to be looking for, a good evaluation structure, and so that should be built into your work of fundraising as well. And of course, communication. I mean, you are not just communicating with your policymakers or just communicating with your members or community stakeholders. You're communicating a much bigger picture about the work and the scope and the vision of your Food Policy Council. And the more you do that, the more likely funders are going to pay attention. They're going to be much more interested in your work. I think I always find myself becoming sort of wrapped up in the kind of the question of policy versus projects, and do we get a project funded as opposed to sort of core policy work, and recognizing that there's often a lot of gray area, a lot of overlapping area. I think that Rhode Island has done a good job of sort of distinguishing their role as a policy organization and what they do to kind of move projects along. But I would say that what they're doing as an example of moving their projects along has very clear policy implications, both immediate and long term. And so when you're looking for project funding, keep in mind that it should have some relevance down the road to bigger policy actions. I think the fact that, I can't remember now who said this, but that food has an impact on every aspect of philanthropy. I think that was a really brilliant statement, and one that we need to pay attention to, because it is about health, it's economics, it's food security, it's food access, it's education, et cetera, et cetera. And the more we can talk about that and demonstrate that the food system is that broad and has its tentacles into so many different aspects of our lives, the more likely you are going to successfully open up philanthropic doors. Just a few other sort of kind of thoughts on sources. We've heard mostly sort of the community foundation, regional foundation approach, but keep in mind that healthcare foundations are big funders these days of food system work, and have, in fact, in some areas around the country, made a very significant contribution to the development of food policy councils. So you should be looking kind of far and wide in that arena as well. As I sort of mentioned earlier, that there's opportunities, I think, when you're getting started to fund your planning and training work, so that you can get yourself off the ground in the right way. That you've really been thoughtful about your beginning process and who's engaged and how you are engaging the community and how you're engaging policymakers, and looking for good funding so that you can get some expertise to help you in that is essential. Don't be shy about asking for money, particularly when if you're working with city and county government. Oftentimes I find food policy councils simply looking for the endorsement or the support in kind of a general or political sense. We want them to put up money as well, and you need to be very clear that that's part of the expectation. There are some federal sources. The Community Food Project Grant Program in particular has been a funder of Food Policy Council work. So, and there have been others as well. So keep an eye on that. And don't overlook the potential of your own members as kind of as an in-kind support, particularly perhaps larger nonprofit organizations and institutions that may be stakeholders and may be able to contribute something in terms of their time for fundraising or special projects. You never know. I've found just walking around and talking with agencies, government agencies, you suddenly discover, oh, they get a little pot of money over here, and this just might be something they can put $10,000 or $20,000 into this year. You need to get to know who your members are and what kind of resources they have available, and spend time to cultivate them. I think lastly, I'm just going to say the sort of the obvious point to me is you need to be creative, and you may need to cobble together funding from different sources, multiple funders, over a period of time, keeping in mind that some of that might be kind of project designated, but also keeping in mind that you need to kind of support your core functions and that bigger policy vision. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. That concludes the webinar, and you'll be receiving a really quick survey from us that will give you an opportunity to give us some feedback on the webinar and also future topics that you'd like to see us cover. So I want to thank our participants and I want to thank our presenters again. It was great to hear from everybody, and we look forward to the next webinar. Signing off.